Hello, and welcome back to the Sinobabble podcast. The podcast is back after a pretty long break, and we're just going to go ahead and pick up where we left off and start talking about the Cultural Revolution. So the Cultural Revolution is one of those huge topics that defies all concerted efforts to organise all the important information into any sort of coherent or meaningful structure, unless you've been reading about the topic for a minimum of 5 years. Personally, I've done my very best to create a series of episodes that cover the major events, that explain the main analyses, both contemporary and modern, and also add some interest by talking about the developments in education, foreign relations, and the economy during this period. Hopefully, at the end of the mini-series, we'll be able to take a look at how the Cultural Revolution has been evaluated by different scholarly camps, and also try to get an understanding of how survivors of the Cultural Revolution feel or felt about the period in retrospect. As there is so much information to cover, I reckon there's probably going to be at least 10 episodes on the Cultural Revolution. It was supposed to be fewer than that, but honestly, it's one of those things, the more you read about it, the harder it is to find things to just leave out. For example, this first episode was supposed to be about the Cultural Revolution until 1969, which marks the initial wave of the revolution that saw the most memorable aspects take place, including the formation of the Red Guards, the major purges of the political elite, and the high tide of violence. However, the more I read, and subsequently the more I wrote, I realised that there was just no way that all of that information was going to fit in one episode. So now that one episode has turned into 3 episodes just covering the period 1966 to 1968. In those 3 episodes, we're going to try and understand what exactly the Cultural Revolution was, how it was launched and why, how it played out both at the political level and among ordinary citizens, both in the cities and in villages, and how the initial wave of chaos and violence was brought to an end mainly through the use of the military. In the previous few episodes, we've discussed the situation leading up to the Cultural Revolution from the end of the Great Leap Forward to the socialist education movement. So we understand roughly the political situation and the dynamics within China's elite that triggered the Cultural Revolution. We know that Mao felt like he had been sidelined in the political and economic realm since the Great Leap Forward by the other elite party members such as Liu Shaoqi, Chen Yun, and Deng Xiaoping. He hated the staid economic plan, the bureaucratism, and the bourgeois ideology that had taken over the party. We also know that Mao feared that the Cold War would erupt into full-scale war with either the US or the USSR, or both, and that he had even prepared a third front military frontier in China's hinterlands in order to prepare for the occasion. Finally, we know that China's socialist baseline was slowly eroding, and the idea of a continuous revolution was fading both in the countryside and in the cities. The Sino-Soviet split had highlighted Mao's fears of revisionism and its power to undermine the regime, which led Mao to try some tactics to jumpstart popular enthusiasm for socialism. However, not only did the socialist education movement fail to fully rejuvenate Maoism in the countryside, intellectuals in urban areas took more and more liberties, going as far as to directly critique the regime and even Mao himself through their literature and art. As we will discover throughout this episode, all of these major factors came to a head in late 1965, when the seemingly innocuous review of an equally innocuous play launched a movement that would throw the country into a decade-long period of chaos. But before we get into the events themselves, we need to address probably the most critical question of all, namely, what exactly was the Cultural Revolution? In his book, Mao's China and After, prominent PRC historian Maurice Meisner points out that the idea of a cultural revolution didn't originate with Mao, but was actually a term used by Western Marxists, as well as Lenin, to describe the process by which an educated intelligentsia would bring positive elements of bourgeois culture to the backward masses. This would then allow the masses to revolutionize their feudal habits, customs, and way of work. In China, the term took on a completely different meaning. It was first used by the leaders of the New Culture movement in the 1910s, the intellectuals that believed that the nation had to undergo a cultural revolution in order to rid themselves of traditional Chinese culture, which was corrupt and holding the country back from developing, And they also felt that they needed to sort of awaken the consciousness of the masses in order to achieve any sort of real socio-economic progress. It was these ideas that directly influenced Mao's political ideas in the following decades, and they're also woven into Mao Zedong thought in general. When we talk about China's Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, there are many problems of interpretation to be dealt with. Historians tend to disagree about pretty much every aspect of the Cultural Revolution, from why it took place, how long it lasted, to whether it was wholly bad or just kind of bad, to what its long-term impact really was. There are, however, some known knowns about the Cultural Revolution, so we're not completely in the dark as to what happened or why. The Cultural Revolution has been studied since it happened and is still actually being studied about and written about today. As one article from the mid-1980s puts it, a non-exhaustive list of possible interpretations of the overall period include, quote, a struggle for power between Mao Zedong and Liu Shaoqi, Mao's quest for revolutionary immortality, a factional struggle between rival Red Guards, the rise to power of Lin Biao and the People's Liberation Army, a radical experiment in social, political, and economic egalitarianism, as well as a human tragedy on a grand scale. Arguably, most or all of these interpretations are valid, and all can be true at once. Hopefully, by the end of these episodes, you'll be able to determine for yourself what the main purpose or purposes of the Cultural Revolution really were. We all know that Mao had grown disenchanted with the bureaucratization of the party and the top-down nature that the revolution had taken on over the past 15 or so years. The revolution had grown stale and sluggish, the struggle between classes had slowed down, and factionalism and corruption was causing problems within the party elite. According to Mao's own definition, quote, a revolution is not a dinner party, or writing an essay, or painting a picture, or doing embroidery. It cannot be so refined, so leisurely and gentle, so temperate, kind, courteous, restrained, and magnanimous. A revolution is an insurrection, an act of violence by which one class overthrows another. So we can first understand the Cultural Revolution as the need to return to class struggle, which had characterized the early years of the regime, and a lot of the campaigns that we have talked about that took place in the 1950s. But what are the classes that we're talking about exactly? Are they still the same classes as those that were identified at the start of the revolution? Are those revolutionary classifications still relevant by the mid-1960s? Well, for the most part, yes, they were. The bad classes, which included landlords, capitalists, rich peasants, and former nationalists, continued to be scapegoated for the nation's problems, despite the fact that all power had been stripped from them well before the 1960s. Class status and class background, so the status of one's family members, was meticulously recorded and used to allocate jobs, to discriminate between potential marriage partners, and to allow or deny opportunities for education. The children of the state's enemies found their opportunities for advancement severely curtailed under Mao's regime. In education, class background was becoming more and more important, more so than grades, meaning that middle-class children were often unable to progress past middle school with their education. The students with the best chance of getting ahead belonged to cadre or military families, followed closely by the children of workers and farmers, whose grades may not have been so good, but who ostensibly had the best class background. Those from bad class backgrounds who worked hard and tried to enter the party were often just seen as being opportunistic and disingenuous. So the children of bourgeois families were growing increasingly dissatisfied with their own lot in life, and frustrated with the party for holding their parents' crimes against them. Some new tensions had developed within society as well. For example, a new system of industrial employment called the worker-peasant system had been introduced in 1964, which was supposed to allow certain commune members to obtain temporary contracts in factories, therefore creating a class of people who were both workers and peasants, and therefore closing the gap between the urban wealthy and the rural poor. However, these new worker peasants were usually just paid way less. They weren't eligible for pensions and they had no job security. Not only that, but factory managers had a tendency to switch permanent roles to temporary contracts, meaning that those who were eligible for permanent urban worker status often found themselves with fewer job opportunities as factories took advantage of the cheaper option of these worker peasants. As an aside, this is a pattern that's actually repeating itself today in modern China, but I don't know, maybe we'll have to wait like 4 years until we get to that part of the podcast. It should also be pointed out that with the rise of the party cadre class, one that Mao lamented had become a, quote, conservative bureaucratic apparatus, hedonistic and corrupt, seeking only power, status and luxuries, so too were their own children becoming part of this newly privileged class. One of the aims of the Cultural Revolution ended up being to rid this class of their unearned, quote, heirs of superiority, lest they become the new class enemies within China. So, the big problem in the 1960s was that of upward mobility and the idea of renewing class struggle. The Cultural Revolution ended up being a way to bring to a head all of these tensions that had been bubbling beneath the surface, and was also a way for the disenfranchised to take their anger and self-pity out on those they felt had wronged them. This comes into play in literally every single part of society, government, the army. We're going to see that in either the next episode or the episode after that. Factionalism doesn't just occur among the Red Guards, the children who sort of wreak havoc on the country. It also takes place within the army, it takes place within the provincial governments, it takes place everywhere, basically. So try to envisage China at this time as a place where tension is just rife everywhere. Everyone's kind of got an axe to grind, everyone's got, some sort of enemy that they would just love to see taken out, and they get their opportunity really, really soon. The Cultural Revolution should certainly be seen as a continuation of Mao's fight against revisionism that we've discussed in the episodes on the Sino-Soviet split, at least at the very beginning of the Cultural Revolution. Most importantly, it should be recognised that Mao believed that the party itself was responsible for the rise of revisionism, especially the leading party members and high-level officials. And so he felt it was necessary to bring the revolution back to the masses in order to rectify this situation. How was Mao able to regain his power following the Great Leap Forward debacle? The other senior leaders such as Zhou Enlai, Deng Xiaoping and Chen Yun had been thoroughly cowed following the 7,000 Cadre Conference in 1962, during which Mao not only escaped blame for the failures of the Great Leap Forward, except for that little self-criticism that he gave, but he also managed to turn the blame around on the party itself. Biding his time, Mao then launched the socialist education movement, which he then blamed Liu Shaoqi for botching, and then continued to attack those in the party who he felt were revisionist or starting to take the capitalist road. When I first started reading about the Cultural Revolution, I personally found it difficult to tell if Mao saw himself in a power struggle with Liu Shaoqi or whether he was just tired of him and the way that he handled things. It was Mao, after all, who had made Liu president or chairman of the PRC, although this was before the Lushan Conference and the economic reforms of the early 1960s. Mao also disliked the way that Liu had handled the socialist education movement in the countryside, but Liu had also defended Mao's honour in the wake of the Great Leap Forward, something that the chairman didn't seem to overlook. It could have been more that Mao feared being purged, just like Khrushchev had been purged, betrayed by his closest senior officials who were tired not so much of his policies, but more of his attitude. Don't get me wrong, there was definitely some sort of rivalry between the two, as indicated by Liu's swift purging during the Cultural Revolution. Sorry, spoilers. But it's not necessarily self-evident, and it may not have even come to a head had the Cultural Revolution not taken place. In this sense, it's important that we understand the Cultural Revolution as being something personal to Mao. He required loyalty to himself as much as to his ideas and his ideology, hence the purging of very senior CCP members who he had previously relied on to help him actually run the country, and the replacement of those people with seemingly obscure upstarts. So now we got a little summary of what the Cultural Revolution was trying to be. So let's move on to discussing the events themselves. Generally speaking, the Cultural Revolution is understood to be the period 1966 to 1976, but some historians believe that it actually ended in 1969, And they see the categorization of the Cultural Revolution as lasting to 76 as not very useful. So, for the purposes of this series, we're going to sort of follow a general division that ends kind of the first part of the Cultural Revolution at 1969. We can consider that the sort of high tide. And then we can sort of consider the post-1969 syndrome, or whatever you want to call it, the sort of hangover malaise of everything that had happened before. The two periods are connected, there's definitely no doubt about that, but they are very, very different, which we will come to see in later episodes. So, let's start with the events leading up to the declaration of the Cultural Revolution in 1965. First things first, we do have some new characters to introduce. Don't worry, they're only relevant for the Cultural Revolution, so don't bother memorizing them beyond these episodes unless you've got an exam or something. So first we have LUO Ruiqing, who was First Minister of Public Security and then later Chief of Staff for the People's Liberation Army. We then have Peng Zhen, leader of the CCP in Beijing and also mayor of Beijing. Wu Han was deputy mayor of Beijing, a Ming historian and a playwright. And then we've also got Kang Sheng, who was a relatively unimportant member of the Politburo until he became head of CCP Internal Security and Intelligence during the Cultural Revolution. We've got Deng Tuo, former editor-in-chief of the People's Daily. And finally, Lu Dingyi, who was Minister of Culture at the time that the Cultural Revolution broke out. Okay, there are also some people that we should already know, but we may have forgotten about, which is okay, because there are a lot of names. So we have Chen Boda, who was Mao's ideology guy and was heavily involved in mass media in China during the 1950s and 60s. There's Jiang Qing, Mao's wife. And finally, Lin Biao, the Minister of National Defense, who took over from our poor dear Peng Dehuai after 1959. There's also Zhang Chunqiao, Yao Wenyuan, and Wang Hongwen. I'll explain who they all are later. And then finally, we've got the main characters from previous episodes, Liu Shaoqi, Deng Xiaoping, Chen Yun, Zhou Enlai. Okay, we've got the cast. Now let's move on to the show. Two events that, on the surface, seem fairly minor, coalesce in 1965 to serve as the sparking point for the Cultural Revolution. The first is the dismissal of Minister of Public Security LUO Ruiqing from office, and the second is the widespread criticism of the play HA Rui dismissed from office, which was written by Deputy Mayor of Beijing, Wu Han. So let's talk about LUO Ruiqing, or just Luo from now on. And to talk about him, we first have to talk about Lin Biao and the PLA. So after Peng Dehuai was deposed, Lin Biao went on a mission to transform the army into a completely red institution that was completely loyal to Mao, well-versed in Marxist-Leninist Mao Zedong thought, etc., etc. So under Lin, the army was modernized in terms of equipment, whilst also going back to its guerrilla roots by abolishing ranks and insignia, limiting the hierarchy to just commanders and fighters. Lin wanted the army to be a sort of model for the nation, an egalitarian institution that loved the party and loved Mao. But while Lin was prioritizing politics, his chief of staff, Luo, felt that the professionalization of the army should be the top priority. After all, if China were to go to war, it wasn't going to be the ideology that saved them. Real preparations had to be made. On top of this disagreement, it appears that Luo may have suggested that Lin should actually quit his job. So Lin had been suffering from ill health ever since the 1950s, possibly from a war wound that had grown worse with time. Luo apparently said that Lin should be looking after his health, while also commenting that older staff should retire. This got back to Lin, who was not impressed with the implications, and didn't like the idea of preparing too heavily for invasion, because that would mean pulling the army out of civilian affairs, which they had gotten more involved with over the years. When Luo Ruiqing published an article in September 1965 on the 20th anniversary of the surrender of Japan at the end of World War II, he suggested that China make plans in case the United States were to invade. For Lin Biao, this was the final straw. He started gathering evidence against Luo, which he presented at a Central Committee conference in December of 1965. In March of 1966, Luo was interrogated, after which he unsuccessfully tried to commit suicide by jumping off the roof of the building where he was being held. In April, it was decided that he was to be dismissed from all positions within the PLA and the party, along with his closest subordinates. The move not only ensured that Lin would have greater control over the PLA, but it also demonstrated that both Lin and Mao had the power to get rid of anyone who didn't agree with their policies. It also allowed Kang Sheng, a close ally of Mao, to rise to a position of greater importance, taking over Luo's role in internal security operations. So that was incident number 1. The second incident is often considered the sort of spark that lit the flame. In 1961, Deputy Mayor of Beijing and Ming scholar Wu Han wrote a play called HA Rui, Dismissed from Office. The story is about a 16th century official, HA Rui, who is appointed as governor of Songjiang. There, he discovers that the son of the former Grand Secretary Xu Jie has stolen land, brutalized, and even murdered one of the local peasants. HAI Rui sides with the peasants, and the local tyrants petition the emperor to remove HAI Rui from office. HAI Rui agrees to step down, but only after he executes the perpetrator and returns the land to the peasants. Wu Han was not a playwright by trade, but rather a historian, and was therefore not routinely involved in publishing critiques of Mao's regime. In fact, many sources suggest that Mao actually had encouraged Wu Han to write this play in the first place after he had told a story about the Fourth Reich and unbending HAI Rui at a 1959 conference in Shanghai. In fact, the play was actually praised by Mao when he first saw it, although his wife, Jiang Qing, apparently didn't like it and had tried to get critiques of it published in 1962 to no avail. Thus, his change in opinion about the play a few years later seems to have come out of nowhere. What happened was Mao accused Wu Han of writing the play as a critique of Mao's dismissal of Peng Dehuai at the Lushan conference. Peng was represented by the upright defender of the people, and Mao the despotic emperor. This is despite the fact that the play had been written before the Lushan conference, and someone had actually brought up the parallels to Mao in 1964, which Mao had apparently dismissed. So why the about-face in 1965? One explanation that's been put forward was that Mao was trying to oust Peng Zhen, the mayor of Beijing and top party official, as he was a tacit supporter of Mao's rival, Liu Shaoqi, and thus going through his subordinate Wu Han was a safe bet. In any case, it seems that Mao allowed his wife, Jiang Qing, to proceed with her criticism as she wanted, at which point she organised with her two writer pals and allies, Zhang Chunqiao and Yao Wenyuan, to write an article criticising Wu Han's play. Yao's article appeared in the Shanghai newspaper Wenhui Bao on November 10th, 1965, and was a harsh, direct attack on both the play and its author. This is an excerpt from Yao's article. Quote, "We all know that, in 1961, after economic difficulties caused by 3 years of natural disasters, and amidst the high tide of repeated anti-Chinese agitation perpetrated by imperialists, various reactionaries and modern revisionists, cow demons and snake spirits, had whipped up Going It Alone and Reversal of Verdicts movements. They sang the praises of the so-called superiority of Going It Alone, asking for the return to economic individualism and demanding the return of lands. In all, they wanted to tear down the people's communes and resurrect the evil rule by landlords and rich peasants. That's why they shout such slogans such as redress unjust imprisonment, in hopes that those representatives of their interests would come out to represent them in the fight against the dictatorship of the proletariat, take up their grievances, and reverse verdicts so that they may return to positions of power. Return the fields and redress injustices are the main points in the struggle of the capitalist class against the dictatorship of the proletariat and socialist revolution." So, amidst all of that waffle, the article is essentially claiming that the play was poisonous, and if it were not gotten rid of, it would be harmful to the affairs of the people. This accusation made Peng Zhen furious, not because it was an attack on one of his subordinates, but because the article had not received formal approval from the party before being published. Just months earlier, Peng Zhen had been appointed by Mao to a special 5-man group, along with Mao's close ally that we mentioned, Kang Sheng, which was supposed to deal with matters of revolution in culture, and was assigned the task of deciding whether or not the play really was a critique of Mao. So Peng Zhen had tried unsuccessfully to block the article from wider publication and stopped a sort of tirade of even more damning articles coming in. Mao ordered the 5-man group to come to a decision, which they did in a document which was published on February 3rd, 1966, known as the February Outline. Instead of discussing whether the play was a critique of Mao or not, however, the outline just said that discussion of the play should be limited to its historical and cultural impact, and turn criticism on revolutionary leftists like Yao, who were acting like, quote, scholar tyrants. Mao, who had been out touring the provinces at this time, was furious when he arrived back in Beijing that spring. He was so mad, in fact, that he had another outline drawn up, this time by his wife Jiang Qing and Lin Biao, which turned the criticism on Peng Zhen, as well as propaganda department head Liu Dingyi and the 5-man group in general. In March, Mao attacked Peng Zhen personally and stated that the propaganda department was, quote, the palace of the Prince of Hell, and threatened to dissolve the 5-man group altogether for their lack of effectiveness. He then began attacking other officials within the Beijing leadership, such as Deng Tuo, and in early May, editorials began appearing in the Liberation Army Daily, calling for a purge of all anti-socialist elements and rightist opportunists within the party, calls that were clearly aimed at Peng and Wuhan. Despite his appeals to the leadership and for his colleagues to come to his defense, it was all too late. The 5-man group was disbanded in May of 1966, and Peng Zhen and his followers were all dismissed from their official positions in the party and government, and charged with being representatives of the bourgeoisie who were attempting to obstruct the Cultural Revolution. This included Liu Dingyi and Zhou Yang, who, if you remember way back in our episodes about literature in China, was head of literally all the literary movements since the mid-1950s, and at the time had been a huge Maoist, so that was quite a reversal in his fortunes. Okay, so by now you're probably wondering, why have I spent so long detailing these two events? We still haven't got to the actual Cultural Revolution. The point is that these two events not only provided the jumping off point from which Mao could launch his attack, although this is obviously important, but less obviously, these events served as a testing ground for the extent of Mao's power and that of his close allies. Wuhan was by no means a strong adversary, so why go to such extreme lengths to have him condemned along with his defenders? The reality was that it was all about the timing. Had Mao gained enough power to push back against those who had been pushing against him? Would the party follow if Mao decided to make a move, or were the winds still against him as they had been at the beginning of the 1960s? Had the nation healed enough from the wounds left from the Great Leap Forward to jump into yet another whirlwind mass movement? The answer, against all odds, turned out to be yes. The party and the people were with Mao, and apparently they were ready to follow his lead down yet another radical revolutionary path. Now we can move on to exactly where that path led. First, a new Cultural Revolution group was set up, headed by Jiang Qing, Kang Sheng, and Chen Boda, and that group reported directly to Mao. A circular was sent out on the 16th of May that warned others may suffer just the same fate as Peng Zhen and LUO Ruiqing, stating that, quote, representatives of the bourgeoisie who have sneaked into the party, the government, and the army, when the conditions are ripe, they would seize power and turn the dictatorship of the proletariat into a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. Some of them we've already seen through, others we have not. Some we still trust and are training as our successors. There are, for example, people of the Khrushchev brand still nesting in our midst. These events escalated things to new heights, especially as word of what was going on in the high ranks of the CCP reached down to the lower party members, many of whom worked in education. This then started a series of events that led to the establishment of the now infamous Red Guards. On the 25th of May 1966, a teaching assistant in the philosophy department of Beijing University named Nie Yuanzi led several other radical teachers and professors in writing a large character poster, known in Chinese as a dazibao, criticizing the university for supporting Peng Zhen and Wu Han and preventing the discussion of the HAI Rui affair. It called on all revolutionary intellectuals to go into battle. At first, the university administration tried to take it down and suppress the whole ordeal. But when Mao found out about it, he endorsed both the poster and its creators, and ordered that the news of the poster should be published throughout the country in national newspapers such as the People's Daily. Following this endorsement, students and young teachers on the campuses around the country began to organise and write posters of their own. Egged on by the Cultural Revolution group, order at schools and universities around the country quickly eroded as students attacked their teachers, administrators, exams, and even the curriculum itself. Fearing a total collapse of order, Liu Shaoqi and other senior leaders asked Mao, who at this time was still away touring the provinces, what they should do about all the chaos. Mao said that they should just handle it how they best saw fit, giving Liu free rein to try and put a stop to things before they got out of hand. So here, some historians have speculated that Mao was deliberately absent during this time so that he could watch his rivals make a series of mistakes while biding his time from the sidelines. Even if Mao wasn't actually being this cunning, unfortunately for Liu Shaoqi, this is exactly what ended up happening. So first, Liu suspended university enrollment for half a year so that the curriculum could be re-examined. He then organised around 400 work teams with up to 10,000 members to go down to schools and universities and restore order by bringing the revolution back under the direct control of the party. These teams were to organise so-called rebel student groups, who would then be let loose on the appropriate targets, who were mainly on campuses and specific ministries. So at this stage of the revolution, the main targets were obvious bourgeois intellectuals like professors, teachers, writers, administrators, and bureaucrats. The state-organised rebel groups got to work right away. Around 90% of the cadres in the Ministry of Finance, for example, were criticised, while 2/3 of officials in the Ministry of Culture were just outright dismissed. It was at this point that the horror that would characterise the height of the campaign also began. In July of 1966, the president of the Steel Institute of Beijing, Gao Yisheng, was driven to suicide. He may have been the first, but he certainly would not be the last. But the movement as it stood, controlled and directed by the party, was not good enough for Mao. He felt that the party's involvement in the Cultural Revolution to such a degree was limiting mass participation, and Liu Shaoqi was making the same mistakes that he had made with the socialist education movement in the countryside. The right people, the true enemies of the revolution, were not being targeted, and instead, low-level cadres or easy targets were just being scapegoated while the true villains got away. Mao abruptly ended his tour of the provinces in July 1966 and started making his way back to Beijing, stopping first to take a quick dip in the Yangtze River, one of the most famous images of the then 73-year-old. It's been speculated that the main reason for this spectacle was for Mao to demonstrate that he was still fighting fit and ready to lead the country on its next adventure. He would certainly need all the strength he had for what happened next. On his arrival in Beijing, Mao made very clear how furious he was with Liu Shaoqi, recalling all the work teams and calling for a central committee plenum to shake up the administration and clarify the aims of the Cultural Revolution. Taking place in early August, the plenum made 3 major decisions. The first was the rearrangement of the top leadership. Peng Zhen and Liu Dingyi were removed from the Politburo, while Liu Shaoqi was stripped of his position of vice chair of the party and demoted from 2nd place to 8th place within the party hierarchy. In his stead, Lin Biao was promoted to vice chairman, making him Mao's heir apparent, and other Maoists, such as Chen Boda and Kang Shen, were promoted within the Politburo. The second thing to happen was a review of the policies of the early 1960s, which can be summarized as a sort of castigation of Liu's work and the promotion of Mao Zedong thought. A report was also circulated approving of continuous class struggle and the promotion of certain model work units such as Dajai, a village that managed to turn its unproductive mountainous land into one of the most productive villages in the country. Dajai became so famous that it became the subject of movies and books, and the slogan, "Learn from Dajai in agriculture," became a call for all peasants to be self-sacrificing and diligent throughout the 1960s and early 1970s. That's probably something we'll talk about much later in the future. Finally, this plenary session adopted Mao's 16-point decision on the Cultural Revolution, a vision of what the Cultural Revolution was supposed to achieve. The main aim of the Cultural Revolution was to, quote, struggle against and overthrow those persons in authority who were taking the capitalist road, to criticize and repudiate the reactionary bourgeois academic authorities and the ideology of the bourgeoisie and all other exploiting classes, and to transform education, literature and art and all other parts of the superstructure not in correspondence with the socialist economic base. The superstructure in Marxism refers to all parts of society that are not related to production or the means of production, so things like culture, ideology, the state, law, religion, etc. So basically Mao was calling on the people to change their mindset and the culture of China so that it better matched up with the socialist economy that the CCP had built over the past 2 decades. It also specifically stated that those in high positions of authority should be targeted if they were seen to be holding back the revolution. While it did contain some passages about avoiding the use of force and coercion and trying to include everyone in the movement, these were largely overlooked once everything got underway. The events of the plenum and the general tone of the event signaled to everyone that this would be another period of class struggle and political rectification similar to what they had seen in the 1950s. The 16-point decision endorsed the formation of Cultural Revolution committees, which were to be grassroots organizations that were set up in schools and factories and communes, elected by members of the group to ensure that the goals of the Cultural Revolution were carried out properly. But these groups were quickly overshadowed by the true tour de force of the Cultural Revolution, the Red Guards. I feel like before we move on, we should kind of pause to talk about the Red Guard movement in a little bit more detail. Sometimes when people talk about the Cultural Revolution, they kind of make it seem as like the youth of China were just unleashed on their elders, and that the structure and the organization of the Red Guards is really straightforward, like it's just all the young people, but it wasn't quite like that. So the Red Guard stuff can actually be quite confusing. I think it's a good idea to dissect the movement here, and then in the next episode we can talk about the sort of violence and all the chaos that they unleashed on the country, and we'll just cover that for the whole of that episode. So, like I mentioned earlier, a new privileged class of cadre children was rising up, those who benefited directly from their parents' political status and got to go to the best schools, get into university, and study subjects that were deemed to be like top secret and sealed off to ordinary students. There were literally schools in major cities like Beijing that only catered to the children of top cadres and political and military officials. They were basically private schools with better teachers, smaller classroom sizes, amazing facilities. Seriously, one of them even had a zoo. But anyway, apart from being treated as if they were superior, these students acted like it as well. Years of class struggle and socialist teachings had given these children a serious ego, causing tensions in the classroom whereby children of non-red backgrounds were actively excluded or discriminated against. When it came to the Cultural Revolution, this meant that some children were barred from joining Red Guard groups due to their family history, which in some cases was examined as far back as grandparents, great-uncles, etc. The politically privileged children worked hard to maintain the bloodline theory, sending out leaflets proclaiming their superiority. One of these leaflets from a Beijing school stated that, quote, "We are the natural-born rebels. We are born into this world only to rebel against the bourgeoisie and carry the Great Proletarian Revolutionary banner. Sons must succeed the power seized by their fathers. This is called passing the power on from generation to generation." The most famous of these statements was in the form of a traditional Chinese couplet, which read, quote, "If the father is a revolutionary hero, the son is also a hero. If the father is a reactionary, the son is a bastard." These groups, made up mainly of teenagers from middle schools and some from universities, eventually became so hierarchical that those with parents who were not senior enough within the officialdom were not permitted to join certain groups. Certainly those with black or just general non-red backgrounds were excluded and even attacked by their classmates. In Beijing, for example, only 15 to 20% of students were eligible to join, or you could only join secondary groups like the Red Outer Circle or the Red Allied Army. These elite groups of students were the first to carry out violence associated with the Cultural Revolution throughout the summer of 1966. After the 11th plenum had concluded, a series of 8 Red Guard rallies were held in Beijing, bringing together a total of 13 million students between August and November and unleashing them on the city's inhabitants. The main targets were any symbols of Western and bourgeois lifestyle, as well as the so-called Four Olds: old ideas, old culture, old customs, and old habits. Young women were forced to cut their hair short, as well as remove tight-fitting clothes and high heels. Something called the ink bottle test was instituted, where if an ink bottle was put down the pant leg of a girl's trousers and couldn't fall freely to the bottom, the trousers would be slashed up, which kind of defeats the point, in my opinion, of trying to achieve modesty, but whatever, it was symbolic. Members of the bourgeoisie were also refused service at barbershops, tailors, laundries, and restaurants. Many people had to lie about their class background just so they could get on with daily life. On top of this, around 77,000 members of the Black Five categories, capitalists, problematic people, and their families, were all sent to the countryside during this period. Humiliation was a daily occurrence, and far from stopping it, the party actively encouraged it, running editorials in the People's Daily with titles like "This is excellent" and "Workers, peasants, and soldiers must resolutely support the revolutionary students." But this doesn't mean that these students went totally unchallenged. Of course, those from bad class backgrounds felt unfairly targeted, and even those from red class backgrounds felt that things were going a little bit too far. Many red students pointed out that barring all non-red students did not facilitate the party's aims of ideological remoulding and achieving the unity of the majority of people. And in fact, if class origins were traced back far enough, even the most red students would eventually become black. One of the most famous denunciations of the early Red Guard movement was written by 24-year-old Yu Luo, a member of the bourgeois class who had not been able to attend university. He mocked the groups destroying artifacts and renaming streets, writing, quote, "I hear that Red Guards changed the names of all the shops at Wangfujing." This is a very famous street in Beijing. Now there are at least 5 streets in the city called East is Red Avenue, and over 50 shops with the name Red Flag. It seems that anything that might evoke memories of the old time must now be obliterated. Yet the new world is so lacking in substance. No wonder all we have is 50 red flags. I went to Wangfujing today to take a look. It's all chaotic and messed up. Most of the shops' names, placards were smashed. Rong Baozai, which is a bookstore specializing in antique books, was all but destroyed. Some even suggest that books in the municipal library that do not conform to Mao Zedong thought should be banned. In 1967, the CCP's Cultural Revolutionary Group deemed Yu's essay a poisonous weed. The then 27-year-old Yu Luo was sentenced to death in 1970 at a public trial and was later executed in a stadium in front of 100,000 people. While his death is a symbol of the type of violence permissible during this period, his frustrations with the early Red Guard movement reflected the feelings of an entire excluded group. These excluded students were finally given a chance to let loose in the autumn of 1966, when a critical turning point in the Cultural Revolution was announced by Mao. In October of 1966, it came to light that Mao was not happy. The students, he felt, were preoccupied with the Four Olds, Western clothing, and other trivial issues, which worried him, as these were not the targets that he'd originally intended for the revolution. What Mao had actually wanted was for the revolution to target high-level cadres, i.e. non-Maoists whom he perceived to be his enemies within the establishment, who were holding back the revolution. In a series of speeches and editorials written for China's National Day on October 1st, the Cultural Revolution group appointed by Mao pointed out that it was the party that was to be the main target of the revolution. Conservative factions should let go of their obsession with the Four Olds, and students from bad class backgrounds should be allowed to join the Red Guards. This then led to a huge surge in the number of Red Guard groups formed, creating a brand new conflict among the students. As the Red Guards had been permitted to attack officials, this meant that the parents of many of the leaders of the original Red Guard groups were now possible targets, falling from their pedestals only to become villains themselves overnight. This made many of the original Red Guards put their backs up, claiming that they were the only legitimate groups, and those who struggled against veteran cadres and stormed party and government offices as they pleased were disgusting and a disgrace to the Red Guard name. But, by the end of the year, the bloodline theory had even lost the backing of the Maoist leaders, as it was seen as a hindrance to true revolution. Indeed, things were getting increasingly chaotic. In November and December, Red Guards were allowed to enter factories and communes, and workers were authorised to form their own revolutionary rebel organisations, completely undermining party authority at every level. This is something that we're going to see in Shanghai in the next episode. As for those students who were neither from bad classes nor from particularly elite families, they tended to divide themselves up pretty equally among both the conservative rebel groups and the radical Red Guards, depending on which one suited their personal aims better. As with most revolutions, personal gain came to matter equally, if not more, than the original ideology and politics that had started the Cultural Revolution in the first place. At this point, the Cultural Revolution was beginning to work as Mao had intended. The Red Guards moved about the country to provincial capitals to identify high-ranking officials to be put on trial and punished. Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping were forced to write criticisms, and the Red Guards produced wall posters attacking the two men throughout the winter. Other central officials that we've mentioned earlier, such as Liu Dingyi, Peng Zhen, and Luo Ruiqing, were forced to attend mass rallies in Beijing, where they were denounced and abused for hours and hours. At this point, the nature of the Cultural Revolution began to take shape. No one was exempt from criticism, anyone could be a target, and no infraction was too small to be criticised, unless, of course, you were Mao himself. Okay, so that's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Please don't forget that this podcast also has a newsletter. You can subscribe to the newsletter by going to the Sinobabble website at sinobabble.com and filling out your details, or you can head on over to Substack and search for Sinobabble there. If you have Twitter, you can follow me on there at Sinobabble. I tend to tweet things about what's going on in China at the moment. And don't forget that you can donate to support the podcast by going to sinobabble.com and clicking on the donate button. Also, whatever you're listening on, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podchaser, wherever, do leave me a review. It doesn't have to be a written one, you can just rate the podcast. I would really appreciate that. So, that's it for this week. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you tune in to the next episode.